Well, welcome to this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Today, the precarious state of the Canadian military. There's a recruitment and retention crisis. I have read this number. I'm going to check it with our guest, 10,000 vacancies. We don't have the equipment we need at a time when we are being asked to give ever more for the situation in Ukraine. Housing issues, health issues. Whenever we have a question about what's going on in the military, we go to the experts. Vice Admiral Mark Norman retired, former commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. And this is important because of what's going on in the Arctic and in the North. And he was also vice chief of the defense staff. Welcome. Great to see you.
And you as well, Senator. Thank you.
You're in Newfoundland today, are you?
I am, yes. So greetings from the Rock. It's a beautiful
the second best province in Canada. I still put Saskatchewan first, but the people are the same. Really, really good people.
Very friendly, that's for sure.
All right, this is a serious matter here. Is that number, could that possibly be accurate? 10,000 vacancies in the military?
Well, yeah, certainly it can. And I'm going to admit that I don't have any inside access, but right. Like you, I'm basing everything that we're going to discuss today on what is in the public domain. But I think it's important if I could just take a second and put the numbers in context, because I think that needs to be part of the conversation. So 10,000 in and of itself is a staggering number, and I believe it is accurate. I suspect it's probably more than that, but that's a round number. It's important to understand that in total, the Armed Forces of Canada, including regular and reserves, is about 100,000-ish.
Yeah.
And that's what is the approved authorized strength, which basically means that's what the Armed Forces is budgeted to employ, both full-time regular and part-time reserve. And the regular force component of that, which is what the CDS is referring to, is in the low 70s. Again, established, approved strength. And with a 10,000 person shortage, now you can see that the percentage of the shortage becomes even more significant. Yeah. And the other really important part of that is the 10,000 short in the establishment. When you take into account the fact that on average, depending on which organization and what day of the week, et cetera, you're looking at around 25% vacancy in terms of what we call volatility. And that's for everything from illnesses to administrative to holiday, et cetera, et cetera. That's another 25% you're down. So this is a huge problem for the armed forces, and it's a big problem for Canada, and it's been a long time in the making, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that is the point. That and I guess this dates back to the end of the Cold War, essentially, which is everybody said, "Oh, sigh of relief. We don't need to worry about this anymore." There have been hotspots, of course, ever since, but we've really let it draw down to a point where it needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, and certainly in my understanding and my experience, the armed forces have not hit a recruiting target since 2012. And so you look at the cumulative effect of a decade now of recruiting shortfalls. And yes, the other component is what you're referring to. And there are some structural issues here associated with how the armed forces has evolved as an organization, and certain parts of it have evolved and other parts haven't. And so there's a real imbalance inside those numbers themselves, but that's a whole other conversation, but it just speaks to the complexity of the issue.
A couple of things strike me. So I also read in the numbers, 4,500 families of service people, of service members, waiting for housing on base, nowhere to live, can't afford to buy in the market where these bases are located across the country. We've got the identity crisis almost that's going on. Are they sandbaggers? Are they the people that are called in to go into the old folks' homes when there's a crisis? Or are they soldiers, sailors, airmen and women that need to be at the ready? Because we even have the president of the United States talking about nuclear war, but we certainly know we have a live one in Ukraine.
Yeah. So that, yeah, you've touched on a couple issues there, and I think they're good ones. I mean, the purpose of any organization is a huge component in attracting people. So, as you've just mentioned, that there is I genuinely believe there's a bit of an identity crisis in that context. And when we look back, not even 10 years ago, certainly in the context of the Afghanistan conflict,
right.
Whether the entire nation was rallying behind the armed forces is immaterial. That there was a huge majority of people who were,
Yeah.
and recruiting was really high, and people felt a purpose, and operational deployments, even in a Cold War context, operational deployments were significant, and people could see themselves in those missions. And now we have the very tension that General Eyre is referring to, where he's talking about the need to basically curtail activity because there's insufficient capacity to do the things that you would expect our armed forces to do, which is to go overseas and help. And that could be anything from a deterrence mission as part of NATO, or a goodwill mission somewhere in support of somebody who needs help halfway around the world. But then you've got this domestic challenge, which is ever increasing, and every one of those domestic deployments actually takes people away from their primary duties, which is to get ready for something that they might have to do overseas in a more traditional combat or combat support role. So yeah, that's a real issue. And then the other component of your question speaks to how people feel valued or not in the organization. So there's a sense of, do they relate to the mission? Do they see an appeal in the type of work that they're going to be asked to do? And then do they feel valued by the organization? And of course, the organization in this sense is an extension of the government and the people of Canada. So, and yes, housing is and always has been a real issue. But when we look at the housing challenges that every Canadian is facing, then you have to add the complexity of what I describe as involuntary relocation. So that's one of the aspects of military service that often gets lost in the discussion, which is, if we send somebody to Cold Lake, Alberta, or Victoria, I mean, as beautiful as those places may be in their own right, we're sending them there with their families. They're not asking to go there, and so that imposes a huge layer of stress and on the family.
And their partners may not be able to work or have to give up their job, or the doctor issue, the school issue.
Exactly. And of course, with housing as it is, it's in a crisis in its own right. These are the kinds of issues that are really coming home to roost, unfortunately.
All right, a couple of thoughts from you on the home game versus the away game that you've just touched on. Of course, we turn to our military when there's a crisis, and I assume that most members of the military, as most citizens, will stand up when there's a crisis and help out. But it seems that there's much more emphasis on that. I mean, when you look south of the border, they have a FEMA, an emergency measures organization. They have a National Guard. Like, they've got other civilian support around crises at home. They don't just, as a first issue, always turn to the military, but we don't seem to have those support systems in the same way. So we automatically turn to them. And that does change in people's minds when it comes to the recruiting issue. What am I signing up for?
Yeah, and I think you've got a couple of really good points in that question. So, first, let's just take a look at the structure. And you're right, we do not have a single federal agency that is responsible for emergency management. There are federal departments that have roles and responsibilities as it relates to it, but we don't have a single agency, as you mentioned, as a comparison in the United States. For the most part, emergency response and emergency preparedness in the Canadian context are provincial responsibilities. And so each province has a different organization, a different structure. They're similar across the different regimes, but fundamentally it's a provincial thing. And they tend to be what I would describe as very light command and control structures. So they don't actually have embedded or full-time capacity to do anything, but they, depending on the province, they do have some pre-existing coordination capability, and so they can respond and react and get things moving. But the go-to organization, to your question, is the armed forces, and increasingly so for a couple of reasons. First of all, the numbers of events that are considered to be at or above the threshold that would trigger a request of the armed force seems to be increasing. And I believe, this is anecdotal and it's an opinion, that there is a tendency more to turn to the armed forces more frequently. But nonetheless, the combination of those two factors is creating the very situation you're describing. And yes, it's having two significant impacts. One, it is causing people to reflect. I mean, like you said, the members of the armed forces are they're gonna step up and do what's required, and they always will, and they're great at it. But it does get a little tiresome after a while, especially because it tends to be the same organizations over and over again, because they're the ones that are available. In other words, if you're not deployed, and you look at the Army, for example, so if you're not part of the battle group in Latvia right now, you're at some level of training readiness, and therefore you're arguably available. The same if you're not part of a deployed ship or you're not part of a high readiness air capability. It's the same kind of thing. So these are the people who are getting called out, and then they may have to cycle into a readiness profile for a deployment. So it compounds. Plus, they're short people. So it's this sort of compounding series of challenges that the same people kind of jumping from one thing to the other.
And we saw it specifically during COVID, because when they were going into the seniors' residences, then they were getting sick. Then they were going back to base. They were, like, it just went on and on. It just, I don't know, it seemed like a distortion. I want to ask about another issue that's out there and be sensitive to it. I mean, I have a reaction and I know why the CDS, why Wayne Eyre is doing this, because he does have these recruiting issues, but relaxing all the standards. You can have long hair and you can have tattoos and you can have, your fitness requirements may not be the same and the uniforms are changing. Is that also part of trying to find that path between the discipline of the old days, quote unquote, and trying to get a younger generation interested in service to country?
Yeah, I think in the simplest terms possible, the answer is yes. The idea here is to broaden the appeal, or to perhaps in a negative context, to remove what could be either real or perceived impediments to a potential interest in the organization. Whether they're stereotypical beliefs or myths associated with the organization, or whether they're actually substantive issues. And for the most part, what I'm hearing inside the rank and file is that it's all being very, very well received. I don't know whether it's going to have a material impact on recruiting or not, but I think the essence of this, as you inferred and as I said, is to broaden the appeal and to remove any perceived restrictions, cultural or otherwise, as it relates to the institution, while not compromising the fundamentals of an organization that ultimately is there to fight if necessary. And what people look like and how they dress, it really doesn't affect whether they can fight or not.
Just as long as the fitness part is there.
Well, yeah, exactly. and physical and mental resilience, their training, their motivation, and we've seen this in other militaries. Hair standards and stuff like that. They just they don't matter in the grand scheme of things.
The other, I think, issue that, and I don't know, I'll ask your best guess on this too, which is the treatment of veterans has not been great in this country. Every government that comes along promises they're going to fix it and change it, but it doesn't ever seem to get really fixed, particularly veterans with mental health issues, PTSD and other things. We haven't figured it out. Stories in the last few days about, someone at VAC giving advice to a veteran that, he should consider medical assistance in dying if he can't fix his problems. I mean, this is just not on, and sends a signal too, I'm assuming, in the recruitment process, is that we might not care about you when this is over.
Yeah, and so this is another, I'll call it a symptom of the bigger issue around how we care for the people who serve and their families. And once they cease serving, what is the state's obligation as it relates to looking after those who have served, and more importantly, have been injured while serving, whether those are physical or mental injuries. And I agree with you. I think this is a recurring problem. I think it gets risk managed, which is never an effective way of actually getting to the crux of the matter, but it tends to just sort of move things down the field, so to speak. It is an issue. I don't know that a young Canadian of whatever type.
If you're 19, you're not thinking about that.
Right. And even if you're in your mid late 20s, and you might even be in an existing relationship, the thought of what it's going to be like when you retire or when you leave the military, if something happens to you, is probably not front of mind. But I will tell you the kinds of things that are is, how quickly can I start getting paid? When do I do my training? Where are my family going to live? What are the conditions of life beyond the service specifically itself? What are those things going to be like? And those are legitimate questions. And those are the kinds of things that are somewhat, they're a bit of a challenge right now. They're always they always have been a challenge. But when we see things the way they are, and we see the state of the economy and other things, there's labor shortages, all these things, they're all compounding the problem.
And go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if you can't offer somebody a job, either within hours, days, or weeks, then you're completely lost at this particular moment in time. So that's one of the issues.
So much out there. The other issue I just want to touch on just before we go to equipment, because of course that's the other thing, what am I going to go to war with? Am I going to have the equipment? But we've also seen in the last little while, in an attempt to reform the issues inside, leadership being taken out, and yourself included, due to contrived political scandals or the kind of the sex scandals that we're seeing. So we're seeing people in the leadership attacked and further down. Now, that gives comfort to some people who've been victimized by these people, but it may also create fears in others, which is, do I want to subject myself to that based on something I might have done 25 years ago? How do you weigh that balance out?
Yeah, so I think at the crux of what you're describing, this is the tension between the role of individuals in institutional leadership and the life and survival of the institution itself. The institution is bigger than anyone. And yes, although there may be arguably a sizable slice or a cadre of leadership, it's generational, that are being implicated in a variety of things or being removed. A healthy institution, and there's the key word, is always ready to fill those vacancies. And although it might seem surprising, right, you lose, generations and decades of experience, but at the end of the day, you've got generations and decades of experience that are ready to step up, provided they are ready to step up. And for the most part, they are. And my experience has always been the folks coming behind tend to be more talented than the ones that are leaving, but that's my own opinion. But that's only one element. And then there's the institutional component of this. And this is I think, where I would offer an opinion and an expression of frustration. Institutions like the armed forces do not exist in a vacuum. They exist as part of a set of national institutions, of societal institutions that form and define, shape, and ultimately, in the case of an armed forces, they protect the society that we're all part of. And when an institution is kind of thrown to the wolves, so to speak, right, which is what I believe, to a certain respect, has happened here. And it doesn't mean that I believe there's a complete legitimacy to the kinds of things that are coming to light. And you and I have discussed this before, and I believe, as painful and cathartic as this is, it is going in the right direction, and it ultimately will be a good thing. But an armed force needs to feel that it is valued and it is appreciated, not just by the people it serves, but ultimately by the government, and that there's a recognition that this is important. And there tends to be a lot of superficial cheerleading that doesn't necessarily translate into substantive support. And that crosses many domains of the conversation that we're having right now.
Yeah, because that, like every other issue, is a lot about sometimes virtue signaling, but are you really there to support your men and women who, whatever side of the coin they're on, need to know that their back is covered, right?
Yeah, and it's one thing, and I believe there is, to a certain degree, there is genuine support for the individual women and men of the armed forces, but I'm not sure that there's an ideological commitment to the values of the institution and why an armed forces is really important and what its fundamental essence is, which goes back to one of your earlier questions about why do you have the armed force, and therefore why do you want people to join it? And that is a conversation that isn't happening.
Yeah, and that's a message that's not being sent, which is we do believe we do have a commitment to a military, where that doesn't mean you're a warmonger. It means you have to do your part. We're a NATO member. We have allies. We have commitments that we've made, and you have to be ready to put your money where your mouth is.
Right. And an international withdrawal, whether it's explicit or implicit, over time, which then also is complicated by an increased tempo and demand associated with domestic activities, tends to, as you mentioned in a previous question, it tends to send some really strange signals, both to the people who are serving and to those who might be considering serving, whatever their motivations might be.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about planes and ships and
big shiny objects, as I call them.
Big shiny objects. So many people are focused yet again on the Arctic at this point because it is, Russian planes are forever piercing our airspace up there. They've been doing it for a long time, but as the Ukraine situation unfolds, we're seeing some kind of, maybe a stronger connection between Russia and China, and they are both up there and both have equipment, and we don't. I think there are 7 ships currently in the yard undergoing repairs. We don't have underwater capability nearly what we need. What is our state of readiness in the north?
Well, it's pretty bad, and it's bad. It's bad for a couple of reasons. One, it's not something that we have really taken seriously, and the existing
It's where the rubber meets the road, right there.
right, and I've commented before that Canadians have a very romantic view of the Arctic and what it means, and the reality is that first of all, it is a strategically significant area of our country for a variety of reasons, but let's focus on security and defense at the moment. Secondly, it is a extremely difficult and inhospitable environment to operate in, and there is a significant lack of infrastructure, and the infrastructure that is in existence is either very old, tired, and in dire need of replacement, or it's primarily there to support a private sector commercial activity. And so we haven't figured out how to be smarter about this. We look at a Civic as a classic example. So the previous government announced, I believe in 2007, that we were going to establish a fueling facility and on the north side of Baffin Island. It's still not operational. In fact, it's although the fuel tanks are there, the jetty is now considered. I don't know if it's been condemned, but it's in really bad shape. It was supposed to have been refurbished. There were lots of discussions. Meanwhile, on the other side of Baffin Island, not too far away, the next bay over, we have a massive private sector infrastructure capability, complete with an airstrip, fuel facility, and a deep water port. So why are we doing these kind? And I'm not saying that it was a wrong decision. I'm just saying we need to get smarter. We need to be more efficient in how we do these types of things. And but to the bigger issue that you're getting at, the challenge with this is, first of all, it's no longer just a long-range bomber problem.
No, exactly.
What it traditionally, and I know you know that, but it's now multidimensional. The underwater domain is a huge challenge. We do not have the kinds of sensor capabilities that we should have. Obviously, the submarine capability is well documented as being deficient, and
that's a kind word,
right? And so, the NORAD modernization has been, I think, minimized in its significance for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to offer an opinion on. But the reality is that it's much bigger and broader, and it's all about what role do we want to play in effective defense of the continent. And yes, to the essence of your question, we've already seen the Russian approach to their strategic priorities. If they decide they're going to do something, we know what they're going to do. May not know exactly when or where. And as far as the relationship with the Chinese is concerned, again, I'm on the public record as saying this is very concerning, and people should be paying attention. Arguably, they have no role to play in the Arctic from an Arctic nation perspective, although they identified themselves as an observer, and they're building more ice-capable ships than the other Arctic nations combined. So, we need to wake up and pay attention.
It seems to me that governments have to step up. I mean, if you do a public opinion poll and ask Canadians, do you want to spend more money on ships and planes and guns and tanks, or do you want more healthcare? They're going to say more healthcare, because we don't really create, as we do see in other countries, we don't create that military civilian connection. Our bases tend to be remote and outside of big locations. And, you can grow up in this country without ever seeing anybody in uniform or driving past a base. And so there is it's hard to build that public support. So one, we should be doing a better job on that. But two, it does mean it's up to governments to say, look, we've got to spend on this, whether it seems sensible or not, because we don't know when we're going to need it. And it might be sooner than you think.
Right. And okay, so a couple of things to just unpack, because again, you just laid out, I think, some really good points. First of all, the guns versus butter argument is decades, if not centuries old argument, and it's fundamentally flawed because it presents the discussion in a binary context where it's one or the other when we know it needs to be both. And so then you have to have a conversation about what is the responsibility of government, and especially when we have a federated system like ours, a lot of responsibilities are shared or delegated to provinces and the like. But there is one of the few sole responsibilities of a federal government, even in our system, is the protection of the nation. And we have historically and traditionally lived in a system whereby we never really felt threatened. But I think, like I said earlier, institutions like the armed forces don't exist in a vacuum. Well, guess what? Nations like Canada don't exist in a vacuum. And increasingly, and we've seen it in the pandemic, Canadians need to realize that we're no longer insulated from what goes on in the world around us. We're seeing the impacts of what's happening in Ukraine. We saw the impacts of the pandemic. And no, those are not direct military threats to Canada. But the reality is what happens halfway around the world has an impact on our lives. And more importantly, if we really take ourselves seriously with respect to our views of what is right and wrong as we look at the world around us, then we need to be prepared to actually step up and take a stand on some of these issues. And right at the moment, I think we're being hypocritical in some respects. So, I mean, clearly, I have strong views on this, and I think the military is a fundamental responsibility of a federal government, and I think it becomes a political football that gets tossed around. And I think to your other point, although they weren't in order, I think one of the real challenges is that we do not have a culture in this country that enables serious conversations about defense and security. And I think that that's problematic.
The guns versus butter argument is now almost the climate versus security vulnerability argument. It's in the north. It's whether we have an obligation to supply energy to our European allies. I mean, the debates always seem to get pulled off in another direction. Two quick final points here. We are being asked to do more in Ukraine, and it doesn't seem we're able. Is that an equipment issue solely, or is that a commitment issue?
Yeah, it's probably a combination of both. I think there are realistic limitations to what we're actually able to do, and if we don't have it on whatever it is, we don't have it on the shelves, and we can't procure it quickly, then there's not a lot we can do. And what's really interesting is that the kinds of things that seem to be enabling the Ukrainian forces are many of the modern capabilities that we're actually struggling to deliver ourselves. So there's an unfortunate irony in that. And then the issue of commitment is, I'm not sure how much we're actually prepared to do. I think there's a lot going on, and the people who are involved, whether they're directly or indirectly involved, are really working their backsides off to make this work. But it's it's a broader issue with respect to, it goes back to what I said. What are we prepared to do to actually support our own rhetoric? And I think that there's a significant gap between what we say and what we do.
Yes, we have your backs. We just don't have anything to protect it with. One of the really troubling things I've seen in the last few days is 30 former British fighter pilots have moved to China to teach the Chinese military how to fly planes. We don't have an answer here as to whether or not that kind of brain drain is going on, but they are being lured with cash, money, better payment, and the ability to actually fly in equipment. We need to take this on, I think.
Yeah, well, I think, I agree. So, and it's not that you're doing it, but it's easy and overly simplistic to vilify the individuals themselves. But at the end of the day,
yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm saying there's a
no,
reason.
I know you're not. Yeah, it's a bigger, deeper issue. How do we let this happen in the first place? And how can it be prevented? And I mean, at its core, this is mercenaries, right?
Yeah.
And they've always been there, and they continue to be there. I mean, private security in Afghanistan and Iraq, all the same kinds of things.
Yeah.
But when you're training a potential adversary, that starts. I mean, that's over. As far as I'm concerned, that's crossed the line.
Yeah.
And I agree that it needs to get more attention. And I just hope there's no Canadians involved. But
me too. Admiral Norman, thank you so much. We could carry on this conversation forever, but it's just, there's so many things in the news right now that I really felt we needed to touch base and kind of hear, a sane, rational thought on what we have to do as a grown-up country, is that we have to have a grown-up military with the right equipment to defend us. So thanks for making the case.
And thank you, Senator. And it starts with a grown-up conversation too.
Yeah, you betcha.
Yeah.
Vice Admiral Mark Norman, former Canadian commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, former Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, well decorated, dedicated his life to military service, and now he's, you're making your contribution to the civilian debate as well. So thank you again. We'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense. We'll see you soon.